Read Out Loud Articles has no affiliation with this article. Article: Men Without Chests. Written by Brett and Kate McKay, May 20th, 2018, and last updated September 22nd, 2020. Found at artofmanliness.com. We make men without chests, and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor, and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldlings be fruitful. Quote by C.S. Lewis. Have you ever come across the above quote? I had, and even in the absence of its context, it's taken from the fairly dense first chapter of Lewis's The Abolition of Man, figured I understood what it meant. Modern society creates men who lack a chest-swelling virility, and then complain about the lack of upright, manly men. However, having recently taken the time to actually study the full context of the quote, I learned that Lewis was actually getting at something different. Or, more accurately, that he was not describing the loss of manly virtue itself, but rather the mechanism by which it, along with other types of virtue, is produced. In fact, by chest, he doesn't mean some kind of literal or metaphorical scaffolding of masculinity, but sentiment. His lament is that modern society makes men without heart. The Tao of Sentiment. Nearly all religions and philosophical schools, whether Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, or Platonism, Lewis observes, posits that there is an underlying natural order to the world, and truth is that which most clearly reflects and explains this reality. To uphold this doctrine of objective value is to believe that certain attitudes are really true, and others really false, to the kind of thing the universe is, and the kinds of things we are. Lewis feels this perspective is best described by the Chinese concept of Tao. Begin quote. It is the reality beyond all predicates. It is nature. It is the way, the road. It is the way in which the universe goes on, the way in which things everlastingly merge, stilly and tranquilly, into space and time. It is also the way which every man should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, conforming all activities to that great exemplar. End quote. Within the objective reality of nature exist people, places, and things which possess an objective value and are thus deserving of varying levels of esteem and respect. Open quote. Until modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. End quote. Given that the value of things is objective, then they should elicit certain responses from us. The night sky should elicit a feeling of humility. The story of a courageous warrior should elicit a feeling of veneration. Little children should elicit a feeling of delight. A friend's father's death should elicit a feeling of empathy. A kind act should elicit a feeling of gratitude. While the nature of emotional responses is partly visceral and automatic, a man's sentiments also have to be intentionally educated in order to be congruent, to be more in harmony with nature. Such training teaches a man to evaluate things as more or less just, true, beautiful, and good, and to proportion his affections as merited. As Lewis notes, this training was considered central to one's development throughout antiquity. Open quote. St. Augustine defines virtue as ordo amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which are really pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful." End quote. The man who leaves a one-star Yelp review for a national park, scoffs at the brave deeds of a soldier, decides that attending his father's funeral would be too much hassle, or fails to say thank you for a gift, shows the lack of this kind of education of the sentiments. If one believes in objective order and value, then the failure to feel the proper sentiment in the face of a particular stimulus cannot be justified on the basis of mere personal preference, casually categorized under the rubric of "to each their own." Rather, it must be frankly countenanced as a deficiency in one's human makeup. As Lewis confesses, "I myself do not enjoy the society of small children because I speak from within the Tao. I recognize this as a defect in myself, just as a man may have to recognize that he is tone deaf or colorblind." To follow the Tao in this sense is to see things as possessing a quality which demands a certain response from us whether we make it or not. Given this perspective, emotions are themselves either rational nor irrational, but do play a central part in following the dictates of reason. Open quote. Because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective order, therefore emotional states can be in harmony with reason when we feel liking for what ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason when we perceive that liking is due but cannot feel it. No emotion is, in itself, a judgment. In that sense, all emotions and sentiments are illogical, but they can be reasonable or unreasonable as they conform to reason or fail to conform. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. End quote. A dangerous dissection. The Taoist system, as described above, existed anciently and across many religions and philosophical schools for thousands of years. It began to be dismantled, however, in the post-modern age, and it is this dismantling that Lewis seeks to counter in the abolition of man. In the 20th century, it began to be posited that there was not a natural order to the world, and that things did not possess an objective value which demanded a certain response. Rather, people simply brought their own feelings to objects, and these feelings are what gave the objects their value. Such feelings were culturally conditioned and relative to particular societies and individuals, and were thus completely subjective. Lewis observes that certain corollaries followed from this conclusion, mainly that judgments of value are unimportant, all values are subjective and trivial, and emotion is contrary to reason. Rather than education seeking to improve young people by both increasing their stock of facts and honing the sensitivity of their sentiments, students began to be tutored in facts alone. This shift was thought to benefit youth, protecting them from the emotional sway of propaganda. But Lewis argues that not only did dropping an education in an emphasis on sentiment fail to provide this protective effect, and in fact made students more susceptible to hype and disinformation, it atrophied their capacity for virtue and human excellence. Lewis sees those who propagated the first error as having misunderstood the pressing education need of the moment. Open quote. They see the world around them swayed by emotional propaganda. They have learned from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is to fortify the minds of young people against emotion. My own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propagandists when he comes. For famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. End quote. What Lewis is saying is that young people have a propensity towards apathy or cynicism or sterile complacency anyway. And if you only magnify this cynicism by telling them that all value and emotion is subjective and that absolute truths do not exist, then you create a thirsty vacuum that is actually more vulnerable to being filled by advertising and propaganda. Being subjected to the endless debunking of ideals imparts to young people a smug pleasure in their own knowingness that can disguise an ignorance that leaves them susceptible to the enticements of disinformation. Really protecting one's mind from indoctrination requires filling it with positive truths that are both well-reasoned and animated by sentiment. A man with a well-honed sentiment for an ideal, a real love for something, rises above the cheap plays of propaganda. A man who loves democracy deflects rhetoric that merely encapsulates a false simulacrum of it. A man with sentimental love for the philosophical value of simplicity tunes out the enticements of advertising. A man with noble sentiment for intimacy and romance sees through the siren song of porn. Emotional sentiment not only functions as a defense against negative propaganda, but acts as a catalyst for offensive activity. As Lewis argues, dry rationality alone can never be a sufficient spur to positive action. Open quote. No justification of virtue will enable a man to be virtuous. Without the aid of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. I had sooner play cards against a man who was quite skeptical about ethics but bred to believe that a gentleman does not cheat, than against an irreproachable moral philosopher who had been brought up among sharpers. In battle, it is not logical syllogisms that will keep the reluctant nerves and muscles to their post in the third hour of the bombardment. The crudest sentimentalism about a flag or a country or regiment will be of more use. End quote. Lewis compares his view of the importance of sentiment to Plato's allegory of the chariot, in which the philosopher likened the soul to a charioteer, representing reason, tasked with guiding a winged vehicle pulled by two horses, a dark horse, appetites, and a white horse, honorable spiritedness, or thumos. To really soar, the charioteer needed to harness the energy of both horses, and use the white horse of thumos to pull the dark horse of the appetites into sync. It is far easier to choose the right thing when you're driven to do so by heroic, noble feeling. Lewis puts it this way, open quote, "The head rules the belly through the chest, the seat of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. These are the indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man and visceral man. It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man. For by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by his appetite mere animal." Close quote. Thus, when society stops emphasizing and educating the sentiments, it produces what may be called men without chests, men without real feeling, men without spiritedness, without thumos, without heart. To those who do not lament what has been lost, who are skeptical there is an objective order to the universe and believe in the subjectivity of feeling, it may seem that men without chests are a sign of progress, that they are more evolved, more advanced, more logical and intellectual. But this comforting affirmation is a mirage and an outage, Lewis says. For the chestless among us do not pursue truth with greater keenness. Quite the opposite, since the ardent search for knowledge cannot be long maintained without the aid of sentiment, without a bit of passion. In reality, then, it is not excess of thought, but defect of fertile and generous emotion that marks the chestless out. Their heads are no bigger than the ordinary. It is the atrophy of the chest beneath that makes them seem so. The irony is that those who do lament what has been lost, who mourn the disappearance of men who through sentiment-producing seat of their chests manifest manly virtues like ambition and courage, as well as all the other traits of good character, have no idea as to what has killed off this species of man, and their own role in hastening his demise. Open quote. And all the time, such is the tragicomedy of our situation, we continue to clamor for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive, or dynamism, or self-sacrifice, or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldlings be fruitful. Close quote. This article has been Men Without Chests, written by Brett and Kate McKay, May 20th, 2018, and last updated September 22nd, 2020. Found at artofmanliness.com.